These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, the contours, evolutions, in Africana sociopolitical thought with Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. Africa World Now Project is next. Today, Africa World Now Project collectives Tasneem Siddiqui and Keisha-Khan sit down with Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor and explore the contours, continuities, and evolutions in Africana radical sociopolitical thought. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is currently an assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. Professor Taylor is author of Haymarket Books, 2016, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, where it examines the history and politics of Black America and the development of Black Lives Matter in response to police violence in the United States. Professor Taylor's most recent book, How Do We Get Free? Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective, also with Haymarket Books 2017, won the 2018 Lambda Literary Prize for LGBTQ Nonfiction. Dr. Taylor's research examines race and public policy, including American housing policies. Dr. Taylor is currently completing a manuscript titled Race for Profit: How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Home Ownership, which looks at the U.S. federal government's promotion of single-family home ownership in Black communities after the urban rebellions of the 1960s. Dr. Taylor looks at how federal government's turn to market-based solutions in its low-income housing programs in the 1970s impacted Black neighborhoods, Black women on welfare, and emergent discourses on an urban underclass. Professor Taylor is particularly interested in the role of private sector forces, typically hidden in the development and implementation of public policy in the urban crisis of the 1970s. Professor Taylor's work has been supported in part by a multi-year Northwestern University Presidential Fellowship, the Ford Foundation, and the Lannan Foundation. Our show was executive produced by Keisha-Khan and Tasneem Siddiqui, and, as always, in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program.
I'm joined by Africa World Now Project Media Collective's associate producer, Dr. Keisha-Khan, and we're speaking with Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, assistant professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Professor Taylor's research examines race and public policy, including American housing policies discussed in her forthcoming book, Race for Profit: Black Home Ownership and the End of the Urban Crisis. Her most recent book, How We Get Free: Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective, published in 2017, Taylor returns our collective consciousness to one of the most crucial organizations to develop out of the Black liberation and women liberations movements of the 1960s and 1970s. And the praxis for liberation the Combahee River Collective mapped out in their April 1977 statement. Her first book, published in 2016, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, grounded the movement for Black lives in the historical and contemporary fights against racism, hyper-incarceration of Black communities, the criminalization of poverty, underemployment, and paramilitary police violence, importantly situating the uprisings in Ferguson and the subsequent fervor and consciousness of youth-led movements in the long Black radical tradition. Thank you for joining us today. How are you guys both doing?
We're doing very well, thank you.
Great. Glad to be here.
So again, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Both Keisha-Khan and my scholarly and activist work focuses on social movements organized around land, housing, and economic justice, and looking toward radical alternatives beyond struggle. And we have found your work to be generative in our thinking, and this conversation is crucial given the discussions we have been engaged in in the past few days on evictions, dispossession, and displacement in the Americas. So with that, I'd like to jump into our conversation, and if you would, will you walk us through some of your personal and intellectual trajectories, and what are the imperatives in your intellectual and political organizing work?
That's a big question. Well, I can say, and then maybe we can talk more narrowly about it, but I came into activism at a relatively young age. I think my father was a organizer in the Black Liberation Movement. He was specifically an organizer with a group called the Black Workers Congress, which was one of many groups under the umbrella of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers that formed in the Midwest, primarily Detroit and Cincinnati, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which is just to say that, my family was politically conscious, and, we talked about the news and talked about politics, and so that was definitely formative for me. And I think the first thing that I became, we could say radicalized by, was I read an article in I think it was 17 magazine. My mother had gotten me a subscription to that, and it was about abortion rights and the lack of access that women had to reproductive justice, reproductive freedom. And so the idea that someone else could tell you what to do with your body over a protracted period of time, I think I was 12, was just like mind-blowing to me. And so that was really my eventual route into activism a few years later. I think the first political activism I was involved with involved going to abortion clinics every Saturday morning at 6 a.m. to defend them, meaning that anti-abortion bigots would show up and try to shut abortion clinics down. And so a counter group of protesters kept the doors open and escorted women into the clinics who were seeking out their services. And so from that, it just raised bigger questions about the nature of a society that would go to such lengths to try to control what women did with their body. Maybe there were other things that the society would be invested in controlling. And so eventually I, politically identified as a socialist, and that kind of informed my political activism. And, through that, I was very drawn to the ideas and politics of Malcolm X when I was younger, and that helped to kind of underpin my emergent socialist politics with a race consciousness, but contradictorily, not necessarily, even though my initial ideas were kind of propelled by feminism, that certainly was not the politics of Malcolm X, so I had a range of different ideas that underpinned a general kind of rejection of the kind of politics, moralism, and strange immorality of American society that really was kind of the foundation of my politics that, has evolved over time, but that's kind of where it began.
Mm-hmm. You may not, thank you so much for that. You may not remember this, but I first met you when Northwestern University's African American Studies Department organized a Black Studies conference and brought together
2012.
Right, brought together a bunch of scholars and administrators, but mostly folks who were in Black Studies departments. And I remember meeting you at one of the roundtables they had for graduate students to talk about their research. And it was Corey Walker and I were actually in the same small group, and we had the opportunity to talk to you about your work. And I remember when you started to talk about your research, I was like, wow, this is going to become something. This is going to become one of the most important kind of issues of our time. So, and I was struck by it primarily because of my own interest in housing justice, but certainly the fact that students were taking that up in Black Studies, I think was really important. So the next question that I would have for you is, how have you seen, you're coming out of activism, you're going into the academy. How have you seen this merge between your scholarship and your activism, and how you have really been able to do both and see this, as your vocation kind of moving forward? So how do you understand yourself as a true representative of what a scholar activist is today?
Well, I'll say something about how those things got connected for me. When I moved to Chicago from New York, and one of the first things that you notice when driving on Interstate 94, which goes east to west through Chicago, is the segregation of the city is palpable. It's intense. It's unavoidable. I lived in New York City, where there's segregation in New York, but because the city is so compressed, and because there's a subway that pulls people from everywhere in the city to it, you don't feel that sense of isolation that can come from the enclosure of residential segregation. In Chicago, you could literally go weeks and days and weeks if you live on the south side of the city without seeing a single white person who isn't a police officer, right? And so it struck me moving into the city. And then I lived on the south side. I say somewhat because it's Hyde Park. It's more like the gateway to the south side, but just a few blocks south of there, you see that phenomenon of Black people as far as the eye can see. And in some sense, that provides a sense of relief, to be able to kind of just go through a neighborhood or an area without feeling like you stand out in particular, which was certainly the case when I eventually moved to the north side of the city, where it's not so much the case now. This was in the early 2000s, but where if you saw another Black person, you noticed. Do you know what I mean? Like, well, I'm sure you do notice. Here in good old Providence, Rhode Island. But you would take notice on the north side, and so I became interested in how this came to be and how this developed. So eventually, I ended up working as what was called a tenant advocate for this housing group in Chicago, and one of the things that I did was go to court with people to figure out how to prevent them from being evicted. Chicago had a very robust set of laws for tenants that had been won through struggles in the 1960s, but many ordinary people did not know that these laws existed. And so I was really good at my job. I really loved my job and wanted to stay there. But, my boss was racist, and not in an ambiguous or way that, was that racist? No, it was like, oh, wow, that's racist. So I decided I needed to go back to school. I didn't have a degree at the time. So I worked full-time and went to school full-time for about 16 months. And then I was in a returning adult program, and then I was able to get into a graduate program at Northwestern in this African American Studies program. And so for me, it was very intentional that I wanted to understand how Chicago came to be as segregated as it was. And so in real time, while I was learning about this history and trying to process it, I was also part of a local organizing movement that worked on evictions in rental housing, but also in the private housing in the realm of home ownership. This was happening at the same time as the economic crisis, as it was sort of unraveling the housing market in Chicago. So this was 2008, 2009. And so both of those reinforced each other. The weekly meetings that I was involved in, the organizing meetings that I was involved with, where we would strategically discuss, what families, that we were organizing to keep in their homes, what the political issues involved with either their foreclosure or pending eviction that work was bolstered by the academic study that I was involved in, which was a deep dive into Chicago's history, in addition to more general questions about the role and function of private property in the United States, and how the intersection of race in particular in that led to these distortions that had a disproportionate impact on Black and brown families in the city.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up question about that. And just thinking about, you just told us about how you came into the academy and how it was able to bolster your ongoing kind of interest in urban segregation and the activism that you were doing, how you saw even the field of African American studies participate in really changing how we think about cities, but also your ability to do a certain kind of research that would unveil some of these inequalities. So I guess partly what I'm trying to get at is how you've seen the function and the role of academia in advancing what in essence were your own intellectual as well as political investments prior to coming into the academy.
Well, I'm trained as a historian. So in most African American studies departments, at least a decade ago, you come into African American studies, but then you connect yourself to a quote unquote traditional discipline for the study of methodologies and ways to conduct research. And so I was trained as a historian, which meant that a lot of my research was archivally based, and that you really look at situations and how they change and evolve over time. And you try to pinpoint issues of continuity and change to really understand the development of a particular set of historical factors. And so on the one hand, those are very useful skills. But I didn't really want to be in a history department. I wanted to, in terms of where I saw myself going, I was attracted and remain attracted to the field of African American studies for two reasons. One is because this is a discipline that emerges out of political struggle and in fact sees itself, historically speaking, and I know that this varies from one department to the next, but that sees a very intimate connection between intellectual study, development, production, as connected to the most important political issues of the day, to contemporary struggles, which is to say that it's not about the development or production of ideas for the sake of ideas, but is to inform, to shape political struggles that are seen as crucial or important to Black communities. This is the ferment from which African American studies evolves in the first place. That it was always seen as a place of both intellectual rigor and study, but also political struggle, and that those were seen as being connected to each other, as ways to inform each other. And so for me, being in African American studies has been crucial to the trajectory of my academic career, in the sense that, I would never want to be just sort of isolated talking about these ideas in abstract form. Let's discuss the housing question as just an interesting idea that we can entertain. But, I want to be able to write for an audience that wants to understand and absorb this history in order to do something about the contemporary situation that they find themselves in. This was certainly the motivation for my book on Black Lives Matter, which was not in any way conceived of as an academic book, but was a book written in collaboration with the movement. It emerged out of political discussions and debates I was having with activists within the movement, and is written in such a way to engage with political questions and strategic and tactical debates that were emerging in the movement at that time. And to me, that's the best of Black studies. Like with your book on housing struggles in Brazil, it's not about this, abstract discussion about land and property and Black women in Brazil, but it's being engaged and involved in movements to tell a story, but also to tell a story in such a way that we can learn from and draw lessons from the experiences of these people, to know about it, but to also think about it within our own context. And to me, that's the best that Black studies has to offer. It's a guide to action, but that the rigor of the scholarship and the inquiries are not diluted for that, but they're actually strengthened by our connection to the social movements and the political questions that we think about and write about.
Absolutely. And I should add and say that your work has been translated into Spanish, Greek, French, and German.
Yeah.
So it's important so it really has reached not just a broad audience in the United States, but globally. So think about the impact of the work as well. Yeah.
Well, I was, last summer, I was able to tour Spain and talk about my Black Lives Matter book, both to just general public audiences, but also with activists and activist collectives, really, I think in 5 or 6 cities across the country. And, it was very, I think it was informative for them to be able to, learn more granular details about the movement, but it was enormously informative to me to see a sort of live, vibrant social movement who are grappling with many of the same kinds of questions in a completely different context, but you can still see how we're connected through the exploitation and oppression of capital wherever we are. So, yeah.
And I just wanted to kind of pick up on this thread. So your work engages these complex terrains and these overlapping geographies, and really the challenges of articulating the collective struggles that we're waging. And so, just looking at the corpus of your work, so these the last 3 books that you've been working on, and can you weave us through these significant connections that you're making? Because you go back to the period of the 1960s and the 70s, and there's something that is, we know that there's something that is happening in this moment, the expansion of, judiciary capacities, the sort of mushrooming of hyper-incarceration, the access to the social wage that Black American communities have, and then the closing in of that social wage as well, too. So can you map those connections through your 3 books?
So I'll say that, I look at various iterations of this. So with Black Lives Matter, even though there's a part of the book that talks about the contemporary movement, it certainly looks at the previous period of Black insurgency and makes the connection that the Black Lives Matter movement is able to emerge because of the unresolved issues left by the Black insurgency of the 1960s, which is to say that the incorporation of a small but significant layer of African Americans into the political system, into what we come to know as the Black middle class, meant that the issues that had given rise to the urban rebellions of the 1960s remained unresolved. So issues around access to housing, issues most definitely around police abuse and violence, and really the issues of capitalism and how capitalism's inability to actually satisfy or significantly attend to the provisional needs of African Americans. And so those struggles were deflected, the attention to those struggles were deflected by the ascendance of a small layer within Black communities that becomes hyper-visible because the political status quo wants to hold these people up as proof that the system in fact works. And so as they become hyper-visible, most working class and poor Black people become invisible, and in some cases are seen as civically and socially disposable. And so those issues remain unresolved, and there are periods in which they reappear. So the Los Angeles Rebellion in 1992, those issues of race and class and poverty reappear in a very violent and destructive way, which is unfortunately the only way these things get communicated to the American state. Hurricane Katrina exposes what Danny Glover referred to as uncovering a third world nation within this supposed first world nation. So you get that. And then again, and there's smaller instances. The murder of Amadou Diallo, produces a small movement locally based in New York around that. The small emergence of a movement against racial profiling in the late 1990s that is unfortunately subverted by 9/11, where then racial profiling becomes weaponized once again in the hands of the American state and directed towards Arabs and Muslims, and thus legitimized and rationalized in our society. But then again, Black Lives Matter comes to the fore in 2014, even though there's a small buildup. In 2011, the state murder of Troy Davis, that becomes a point of galvanization among Black activists in this country, but also becomes an international cause that people are drawn to. The murder of Trayvon Martin, Malcolm X grassroots movement puts out their own report that shows that I think once every 28 hours, a Black person is murdered by an agent of the state. And so all of these are building up over time, and eventually, over a short period of time from 2011 to 2014, and then the movement in its Ferguson iteration explodes in the summer of 2014, and then it morphs into a national movement with the simultaneous refusal of grand juries in Ferguson and Staten Island refused to indict the two killer cops who killed Michael Brown and Eric Garner. And then you get, hands up, don't shoot.
You are listening to a recent conversation between Africa World Now Project collectives Keisha-Khan, Tasneem Siddiqui, and Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, where they are exploring the contours, evolutions, and continuities in Africana radical sociopolitical thought. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is currently an assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. Professor Taylor is author of Haymarket Books, 2016, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, where it examines the history and politics of Black America and the development of Black Lives Matter in response to police violence in the United States. Professor Taylor's most recent book, How Do We Get Free? Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective, also with Haymarket Books 2017, won the 2018 Lambda Literary Prize for LGBTQ Nonfiction. Dr. Taylor's research examines race and public policy, including American housing policies. Dr. Taylor is currently completing a manuscript titled Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Home Ownership, which looks at the U.S. federal government's promotion of single-family home ownership in Black communities after the urban rebellions of the 1960s. Dr. Taylor looks at how federal government's turn to market-based solutions in its low-income housing programs in the 1970s impacted Black neighborhoods, Black women on welfare, and emergent discourses on an urban underclass. Professor Taylor is particularly interested in the role of private sector forces, typically hidden in the development and implementation of public policy in the urban crisis of the 1970s. Professor Taylor's work has been supported in part by a multi-year Northwestern University Presidential Fellowship, the Ford Foundation, and the Lannan Foundation. Our show was executive produced by Keisha-Khan and Tasneem Siddiqui, and, as always, in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program.
Michael Brown and Eric Garner, and then you get, hands up, don't shoot, I can't breathe, Black Lives Matter, as these three chants that unite the movement from one coast to the next. And so that is some of the lineage from the 1960s, the unresolved questions that caused the rebellions of that period re-emerge and express themselves in Black Lives Matter. And we should expect to see that again, because those questions still haven't been resolved. And part of it is because they are endemic to the system itself. And that's not just rhetoric, it's understanding that the reason why these crises of police abuse and violence continue to emerge is because they have no other solutions, right? There were partial solutions in the 1960s where you get the rise of the Great Society, an infusion of state-sponsored programs, but then they're always constantly under attack almost as soon as they are built. And today, there is no discussion about state programs. There's no discussion about that. There is only a discussion about partial public-private partnerships or complete and total privatization, ignoring the fact that historically Black people have always called on the state to intervene, not for some great love and affection of a state that sanctioned slavery, that produced Jim Crow, and that produced legalized second-class personhood, but an understanding that in the realm of the private, that racism runs completely unchecked, and at least the state appears to be a malleable institution that with pressure, mobilization, and organization, you can press demands on it that produce some sort of outcomes that reflect some of what it is that you want out of your political agenda. And so in the absence of those kinds of state protections, and we see the erosion of public housing, we see the erosion of public education, we see no public health care, and very little public provision in the first place, the police become the public policy of last resort. The police become the institution that hem in these inequalities, which is why these are recurring struggles in Black communities. And so part of what I'm looking at then are the different ways that Black people respond to these, the reemergence of these crises over time. In this new book on race and housing, I'm looking at it slightly differently, but coming back to a similar critique, which is to say that a tenet of American liberalism has been that the problem we have is a lack of inclusion. That it's not the system, it's not the institutions, it's that Black people don't have access. And to some extent, that's not an irrational argument. I believe that the uprisings of the 1960s were not driven by a nationalist impulse or nationalist sentiment, meaning we want to separate, but they were a demand to be included, that the United States was referring to itself as a nation of affluence, and Black children are being mauled to death by rats in their beds. And that is not hyperbole, that is actually true. And so this was an irreconcilable contradiction that the U.S. is bragging about being the nation of democracy. You're in the immediate afterglow of World War II. There all of this ideological nonsense about freedom and democracy that ushers in the Vietnam War, and you have not just what is happening in the South, that Black people can't vote. I mean, that is enough in and of itself. But the conditions that existed in the Free North were conditions that produced intense radicalization, because there was such a dichotomy between what you were told as the nation and what your actual experience of that was. And so the idea that, well, okay, we will stop holding people at bay. We will bring them in to the system. We will include them in such ways as to change the rules for how delegates are counted in the Democratic Party, so that now Black people can see the Democratic Party as a legitimate vehicle to reach their political aspirations. So you get many Black activists who don't see themselves as selling out, because there's a certain logic to it, right? That we are concentrated in these cities that are run by white machines. Let us run these cities. And so that is part of the compromise. Of course, they do so when all the white people leave and the tax dollars leave with them, and the federal government decides they will stop committing money to the city. So you get the keys to a broke city, and then an economic crisis of historic proportions takes hold in 1973 and 1974. But you could understand the logic of political and community control. So these the allure of inclusion is logical, and it makes sense. And so it's in politics, but it's also expanding the federal government to create jobs for African Americans. And then what I write about, and it's in colleges and higher education, there's inclusion everywhere, right? And so what I write about is inclusion into the real estate market. And I think in order to make Black people homeowners, because as Richard Nixon said in 1969, if they own their own homes, then they won't continue to burn down the cities. So homeownership is seen as a means of social control in the same ways that it was seen as a means of social control in the 1930s, but it's also seen for the real estate industry as a means of to develop new markets. You know, when the white housing market was beginning to saturate, and when they were looking for government subsidization because interest rates were rising, the cost of owning a home was becoming more expensive, and so they wanted government involvement, deeper government involvement in creating homeowners, particularly among poor and working class people. But one of the things that I look at is how the institutions, so when you're just talking about inclusion, you're not really talking about the institutions that people are being included in. And for the real estate housing market, this was a particular problem, because the entire history of home ownership and the housing market in the United States, especially over the course of the 20th century, has been so implicated in racial violence. The entire way that the real estate industry conjured value, right? What is considered to be valuable, what is not valuable, is all tied to degrees and proximity to blackness. So the closer you are to the black, the less value that housing has. And in fact, in the in the 1920s, real estate brokers on the west side of Chicago, who would then go on to become key players in developing real estate policy for the United States as a whole, actually enumerated who the level of whiteness and their attractiveness to housing values in descending order to, number 8 were Negroes and number 9 were Mexicans as the two lowest on the scale in terms of property value, and those groups who would do the most damage to one's property values. So this goes very quickly from the private discourse between real estate brokers into a logic into federal policy. And so the way that real estate was completely implicated in creating and reproducing anti-blackness in the real estate market then gets sutured to federal policy when the federal government becomes involved in helping the development of the real estate industry, and certainly in creating homeowners among the general public. And so by the 1960s, when the federal government ceases to continue its practice of redlining, through the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968, that partners the federal government with the real estate industry to create black homeowners, all of these logics of racism that have created the real estate industry become implicated in federal policy. And so very quickly after these programs begin to take hold, there are, issues of fraud, there are issues of corruption, there are waves of foreclosures that happen in black neighborhoods, and in the end, they blame black women. They blame black women's housekeeping skills for the dilapidated condition of these old houses that were flipped and sold to black people in the first place, on the basis of protecting themselves. So not just people in the private sector, not just the usual suspects of bankers and real estate brokers, but federal agents. George Romney, who's lauded as a liberal, a Republican liberal, was one of the most vociferous in talking about the poor housekeeping skills of black women in particular that led to the degradation of many of the houses that were sold to them, with no mention of the fact that the housing market remained segregated, so black people could become homeowners, but only in the city, and housing in the city was somewhere between 60 and 100 years old. And so people were buying this old housing that was in poor condition in the first place. And so none of that is really included in the story. You're just left with this idea that, if black women knew how to clean their homes better, then this wouldn't have happened. So much so that the Department of Housing and Urban Development created a pamphlet to show black women how to clean house in 1967. It's an illustrated pamphlet that shows how you dust, how you sweep, how you ascend a ladder to wipe off the top of a refrigerator. And it's long. It's 17 pages. It's not, and it's illustrated in case you can't read, you're too illiterate to be able to read. There are pictures on how you actually engage in the process of cleaning. Mind you, of course, that the white congressmen who were having debates about this on the floor of the Congress were employing black women to clean their houses, in the off hours. But somehow in the realm of this program, it all becomes focused on the cleaning skills of black women. So I could go on about this, but
We have to say that this forthcoming book, Race for Profit, let's reiterate the title, Race for Profit, Black Homeownership and the End of the Urban Crisis.
I changed the title.
Okay.
This happens when you write a book. you have a big debate with the publishers at the end when it's do or die time. Okay, so we changed the title. It's Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermines Black Home Ownership.
Yes. Even a much better title, I have to say. Much better title.
Yes, from the dissertation to the book.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that you are bringing a very important history. I mean, there's so much that we're going to learn from this, but most importantly, you've pointed to, one, the paradox of inclusion and exclusion in this country, and what inclusion actually means, and that oftentimes there is a profitability element around, toward the argument and the practice of inclusion, that it's not, we still haven't quite gotten to that point of a real deep discussion around our values as a society, and what racial inclusion means for us as human beings. And I think to have this work really highlight how capitalist gain is still undergirding a lot of the desires for inclusion and diversity and so forth, I think is really, and its iterations, I think is really, really important in how we think about our society. So I think that's really important, and the allure of inclusion, even for Black folks who might just be they're biting a piece of the pie, and not really quite getting the crust, right? Which is the best part. So, but I also wanted to point too that there's a new book that just came out by Carolyn Crockett called People Before Highways, and it reminds me, this is going to be nice to have your book being taught alongside her book, because it talks about that it's not just, so real estate becomes a key piece, and it's important to state that she's teaching in urban planning, Carolyn Crockett, but the construction of highways and train tracks running through running through segregated neighborhoods and further segregating is also tied to the profitability of real estate, right? So I think
absolutely.
So that's
what's keeping the distance, because the further white housing is from Black housing, the more it accrues in value. And this is why you have the suburbs. And so they have to build those train tracks and highways to then be able to connect those people to work. But the idea is that the further away that you are, the more value accrues in your housing. And even as Black housing, it devalues for Black individual owners. It's quite valuable for the real estate industry, because the segregation of African Americans means that you can literally charge people anything that you want. And so Black people are paying higher rents for inferior housing. They're paying more for housing, home ownership, sometimes on contract, and even after the period of land installment contract passes, they're still paying more because of the poorer quality of the housing and what they refer to as the existing housing markets. And so part of what makes sense of that is the creation of highways that are driven through Black communities and Black spaces.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I wanted to say is that we know that this book is going to really explode, even not just history, in terms of urban history, but certainly in terms of even just urban studies in general, and thinking through these power dynamics that I think are oftentimes not being discussed, especially in departments of urban planning, urban architecture, engineering, et cetera. I think there's a way that these ideas are oftentimes being left out and seen, that urban planning is and even how we think about the calculations being made in economics are separate from these discussion around race, power, and class and so forth. So I think that's really important. The next question that I was going to ask is, I know that we're going to be transformed by your work, and we have been transformed by your work in academia, but how do you feel that, and how do you see how communities that are engaged in these ongoing struggles around evictions, some of the communities that you've been a part of, gentrification, and that are really truly engaging the rental movements, the tenant movements rather. How do you see these various housing movements and communities that are waging struggles around housing policy in this country, from California to the East Coast? How do you see them using your work?
So a big part of what I want to do is to help people see beyond that which exists, right? So I always, I give a lot of talks about contemporary Black politics and politics in general. And one of the things that I talk about in the talk is that the problems we face exceed the capacities of this two-party system. So when we talk about climate change, when we talk about the perpetual housing crisis, when we talk about the issues of police abuse and violence, these are not issues that can be resolved on the ballot, right? That, you vote for this thing or you vote for that thing, because they're often not on the ballot, right? They're not questions that are being asked of the public to make a decision on. And so that means that we have to think bigger and we have to think beyond that. And so part of what I'm trying to do is to get us to think about the institutions that we are being asked to be included into, or that is being suggested that if only we were being included into, that there would be some measure of justice and democracy delivered to Black people. And that means that we need to look more closely at the institutions. And so part of what I'm trying to argue is that as long as the United States continues to yoke its housing policies to the private sector, a private sector in real estate, whose entire conception, again, of value has been based on the devaluement of Black people, then these problems in housing will continue to reproduce themselves over and over again. People ask, how is it that after 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, we still have segregation, we still have unfair housing? And it's precisely because the housing policies remain connected to the private sector. How does that manifest itself? Affordable housing, this discussion of affordable housing always is connected to public-private housing schemes. Section 8 is a public-private housing scheme. All of the so-called solutions to the housing crisis are connected to an industry whose value is determined by racial discrimination. And so we need to think about that in terms of whether or not our side continues to call for the same types of programs that the federal government puts forward. So this focus on quote unquote affordable housing instead of what I would describe as universal housing. So in the same way that we've moved the discussion, or at least begin to entertain moving the discussion in healthcare away from affordability to the universal, that this is something everyone is entitled to, that it is in fact a right to have access to medical treatment, medical care, and the drugs that are necessary to facilitate that process, that housing should be regarded in the same way, that this is something that people have a right to, and if it is a necessity for the human species to actually survive, there should not be a price on it. So I would like to introduce that idea. And also the epilogue, the last part of the epilogue to the book is called Against Home Ownership, which of course will be very controversial. But that's part of widening the scope and widening the discussion into a more critical look at the role that private property is playing in perpetuating these housing crises, economic crises, and the social crises in Black communities because of the instability of housing, because people are having to spend 50% of their income on housing. So I see it as widening the discussion beyond these two, housing voucher, affordable housing, all these boring discussions and categories that have been recycled for the last 40 years as more and more people become less and less secure in their housing, means that we need to begin to think of these things in completely different ways.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's an important point. I think when we've been talking a lot recently, and I should mention that you came to Brown as part of this forced displacement workshop, and I think that and I think that it was an important contribution to make, especially thinking globally about how these processes are interconnected. And I think that a lot of us have been trying to do precisely that work around to see what's happening globally and what conversations are taking place globally. This conversation, I think this is going to be a game changer in the sense that this idea around housing being a basic human need, a basic human right, I think is one of the most important agendas of today, right? So you see a couple of folks, I think it's Ayanna Pressley and a couple of folks who've been kind of bringing this out as key political issues. But I would say that the moving away from affordability to universal, and even a sense of a kind of a universal kind of social housing where the state itself sees its role as being playing an important role in providing social housing, that there can be a mass buy-in. I think the key thing is a mass buy-in that even maybe contemplates. I think partly right now people see this as a poor people's issue, and it is a poor people's issue, but it's a much bigger issue when you have so-called middle-class families who are also kind of really pulled apart, trying to survive and trying to gain just basic decent housing, right? So I think there has to be a much more kind of broader buy-in as well as a part of everyone, right? The sense that we need to have universal health care in the same way we need to have a universal housing. We need to have a much better approach to guaranteeing good, decent housing to everyone in this country. I think that's going to be, I'm delighted and I'm excited to read your book, and this argument around against homeownership, I think is going to really push a lot of us to do some deep thinking about how we ourselves
pushing a lot of buttons too.
Right.
Yes.
But how we bought into the narrative of social mobility and homeownership. Even the most liberal and, progressive among us, we've bought that narrative. We truly believe that this is our future. This is.
But this is why it's connected to a range of issues, because it's not just, to me, it's not just about we've all bought into it. I own my own house. I will say that. It's the bigger problem is that in this country you have to buy a house, because that is what helps to finance your retirement. It's what helps to finance your kids' access to college. It finances so many of the endeavors that people experience in life. This is part of the reason why it has produced such psychotic behavior among white people when they feel like their property values are threatened, because in this society where there is almost no social provision, your house is all that you have. And so your ability to maintain property values is the distinct difference between whether or not, what the quality of your life will actually be. And this is a big part of the problem. And so part of reimagining what housing should look like means reimagining a different kind of society as well, where your well-being isn't determined by your access to private property, where your access to home ownership doesn't determine whether or not you have good health care, or if you have a health care emergency, you can attend to it. It doesn't determine if you're going to be homeless when you're 65, or whether or not you will have some measure of comfort. We have to disconnect those things. We have to have a society that actually provides those things so that your access to private property doesn't, make the difference in terms of whether or not you have a good life. And so that's why it's part of a bigger discussion, and why we can't see these things in their own sort of separate categories. Housing has to be tied to these bigger questions about social provision for working class and poor people in general.
Right. And even public education. I mean, a basic.
Yes.
I mean, the fact that where you live can
Yes.
shape your access to good public education,
Yes.
can shape whether, your access to even just to every, what if you have access to good food.
Right.
I mean, and why people are writing about food deserts. But I know that we have, Tasneem has some more questions, but just to reemphasize the fact that these are precisely the kinds, and I always say this, feminist issues. These were
Yes.
issues at the heart of Black feminist struggles that shaped the ideas around intersectionality,
Yes.
et cetera, that we're talking about today. I think that oftentimes feminist theorization have moved away from basic issues such as housing, healthcare, public education. So I really, welcome this book and the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of jump on this conversation of, like thinking about what the ways in which your work is instructive in these movements, especially as we think about, so the nation state is so yoked to private property
Yes.
and to colonialism and the privatization of basic necessities. Like, so we should all have access to universal housing, healthcare, organic food, sustainable free education, sustainable ways of living. And so, and some of these conversations that we had with indigenous communities as well, towards thinking about how do we, your work can be instructive, or if this is a question that, you are pushing us towards decolonizing this concept of the nation state. And one of the indigenous activists said, he had brought up this point of like not towards a socialist state, but toward alternative forms of social organization and how we can govern, and based on alternative modes of social life, new social realities, that social movements are creating, but it's being created in sort of like these small scale, and how we magnify that these movements and this knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point is not to reproduce the state, but is to, is to create a society where the vast majority of people who create wealth in that society are in control of it and determining how it should be used, as opposed to the way that our society is organized now, where the average wealth of a U.S. senator is $3 million, and the average wealth of a person in the House of Representatives is $990,000, and most of them are white men. So we essentially have a government made up of white male millionaires dictating how the rest of us should live in a country where the median income for Black families is somewhere around $47,000, and for white families is somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000. So very average, run of the middle of the road, ordinary people being ruled by the elite makes no sense. And so the point, I think, is there are ways in which we can use the state to facilitate a better distribution of resources. We see it in different societies all around the world. But that isn't an end in and of itself, because you can also see in a number of these social democratic societies the rise of the right, the rise of fascism across Europe, and even in Latin America, and somewhere like Brazil, where you have the Workers' Party in power for so long, but doesn't go far enough. It doesn't go far enough in actually doing the social provision that it creates an opening for the fascists to come and say, well, we can do it. And, and who are able to exploit the fears of people as a way to get themselves into office. We're seeing this phenomenon happen all over the world. We're seeing a more, bizarre version of it in this country with Trump, where you have a bunch of halfway measures initiated by the Obama administration, which really just holds the status quo together, creates an opening for this lunatic, racist megalomaniac Donald Trump to become president. And so, what then does that mean we have to do? I think that we have to build social movements that can pressure the state to whatever extent that we can to redistribute the resources to create more stable forms of social provision. But we also have to begin to think about what Martin Luther King described as the radical reconstruction of U.S. society, that is not about foregoing one form of the nation state for another more democratic form of the nation state. But how do we get to a society of self-rule that, you know, is on a local basis, but where localities are in collaboration and contact with each other. And I think that in that sense, you know, you're from the dominant empire, and people want to know what you have to say and what activism and social movements inside the United States looks like. And I understand that, but I'm always like, we need to learn from you. You know, when I was traveling around Spain, where there's such an intricate network of anarchist collectives of, women hotel workers who had organized themselves to, you know, force the hotel companies to increase their rate of pay per room, you know, cleaning, like all these. There's a level of organization and collaboration between movements that was completely foreign to me. And so in that sense, I think that we actually have, in this country, quite a bit to learn from the struggles, certainly in the hemisphere, where people have been engaged in the struggles over land and property and the right to be somewhere that have raised much more, have come to these much deeper questions about the relationship between capital and access to space than I think any of the housing movements in this contemporary moment in the United States have. Right. And so that's really part of the question, is how do we increase the communication, the creativity, collaboration between those of us here and, folks in the hemisphere and beyond who have been engaged in these processes on a much more political basis over a much longer period of time, that we have everything to learn from and not enough contact with to facilitate that kind of process.
Right. I think in the rest of the Americas, folks are still talking about decolonization among as it relates to Black and Indigenous folks, and I think that for African Americans to begin to see themselves as undergoing a process of decolonization, I think will be very important. And what I mean by that is to understand kind of the legacies of colonialism and slavery, and in terms of how it's impacted and structured their lives, but also how decolonization is going to mean how we understand ourselves as being a part of U.S. empire, right? In terms of not buying into the project of empire, but also figuring out how to understand ourselves as being in alliance with these other communities elsewhere, right? So I think there's a way that part of the struggle over gaining global knowledge and looking elsewhere is I think the decolonization has to take place, right? Mm-hmm. So I think whether it be around learning other languages or whether it be around traveling and moving and doing precisely what you've already been doing and translating the work and engaging scholars and activists elsewhere, is that you're able to see, partly not necessarily to rescue the language of the third world within the first world, but that this is not who we are, right? Mm-hmm. This is that we are fully and on a mass scale excluded from the society. So how do we understand ourselves within a vast kind of global network among the excluded, right? The marginalized, and not necessarily that we are part of U.S. empire, that we have a different vision of the country that is much more inclusive, independent of whether or not we are a minority or a majority, and that we look to other contexts for strategies, for example, the strategy of occupation, of taking over buildings that you mentioned earlier, for how do you, different ways of networks, political networks. I think that could be valuable, how people use particular discursive tools like genocide to talk about anti-Black violence in a way that to bring back those particular discourses that were can be read in a global scale. So I think that part of it is really to think about what kind of education needs to take place on a mass scale for us to see ourselves as being part of a global community of folks who are struggling, and thinking of alternatives, I think, is really important. I don't know if you had one more question, Tasneem.
No, I was going to actually say that this has been an incredible conversation, and we're so appreciative of your work, and thank you again for bringing us all together. I did want to ask, in sort of, in closing, like, what your vision of Beyond Struggle, really looks like, and acknowledging that your work and your vision is very much grounded in Black social movements and the Black radical tradition that has always been inclusive and has always been really thinking about, what we're struggling for, and a radical understanding of what it means to be human.
Well, I think about the, in this country, the ways that part of the importance of the Black movement is twofold. One is that it immediately exposes the central mythologies and lies of the United States, that this was ever a free, just, or democratic country. If you know anything about the history of Black people and the history of indigenous people, that at no point of contact is there anything other than racism, brutality, genocide, slavery, and complete and total repression. And so that is important in terms of being able to expose the lie, but it's also obviously insufficient in terms of what is it that we want. It's not enough just to talk about what we reject and what we don't want, but what is it that we want. And so for me, when I talk about in my book on Black Lives Matter, what is freedom, right? What does it mean to be free? And it's not, I want it to not complicate it. To me, it's the ultimate expression of self-determination, which is the ability to make decisions about one's life free of social, political, economic coercion, and the physical violence that often comes with that type of coercive relationship that currently exists between the American state and capital, and its relationship to Black and brown people. And so to be free is to be able to make those decisions without those constraints. It's a type of freedom that none of us know, none of us have ever experienced, but that I would imagine would be at the absolute root of any different kind of society that called itself free and really meant it.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you for inviting me. Very glad to be here.
Thank you.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Muizu Mutali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funda Ngunda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior researcher and content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha-Khan Perry, technology advisor is Byron Gray of GrayWorks Technology, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.